Welcome to War Room, the official podcast of the U.S. Army War College online journal, graciously supported by the Army War College Foundation. Please join the conversation at warroom.armywarcollege.edu. We hope you enjoy the program.
Make sure not to miss a single episode and subscribe to A Better Peace, the War Room podcast, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. The views expressed in this presentation are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect those of the U.S. Army War College, U.S. Army, or Department of Defense.
Welcome to A Better Peace, the War Room podcast. I'm Michael Neiberg, Chair of War Studies at the U.S. Army War College, and I'm here today with Tim Cook, Chief Historian at the wonderful Canadian War Museum in Ottawa. Tim is the author of, among many other books, his latest book, The Good Allies: How Canada and the United States Fought Together to Defeat Fascism During the Second World War. Tim is the winner of the Templar Medal and a member of the Order of Canada, which is the highest honor that Canada gives. Fewer than 8,000 people have been so honored since the Order's founding in 1967. Tim has also been a close friend of mine for many, many years. So, Tim, I'm really delighted to talk to you, and thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be with you, Mike. Thank you.
Tim, before we get to this book specifically, I just want to note, you and I know a lot of very prolific historians, but you are unusually prolific, producing fantastic books on what I think is a ridiculous schedule. By my count, this is book number 13. So I want to start there before we move on to your latest book specifically. What do you look for in a book project?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Those are generous words. And 13 major books and 6 other sort of smaller and edited collections, which I know you've been involved in too. And I love talking about writing, and I love talking about how one researches and chooses a topic. For me, I suppose it's got to be something that resonates and something I want to do for 2 or 3 years. As you know, these are big, long projects. So often there's a question I want to answer. Maybe my most famous book on Vimy, The Battle and the Legend from 2017, I wanted to explore there that critical battle for Canada, which your listeners will know, of course, the key battle in April of 1917, which has often been said to be the birth of the Canadian nation. And I wanted to explore that. What was meant by that? And of course, so I looked at the battle and then I unraveled it over time. We built our monument there. It's a pilgrimage site for Canadians. And so that was the question I wanted to answer there. This new one, The Good Allies, I really wanted to maybe reorientate the view from Canada and Britain. So across the Atlantic to north-south, over the border. What was that relationship like between Canada and the United States during the war? Despite maybe hundreds of books written in Canada on the Second World War, very few had ever explored that relationship in great detail. So great question. I'm always looking for topics. Sometimes, as you know, you find a great document and you say, this could be an article, or you find a great collection, you go, this should be a book. At other times, it's a question you'd like to answer. And often, Mike, I think I'm like you, it's a topic I want to know more about. So I'm actually teaching myself.
Yeah, I find that too. Sometimes you write books because you're curious about something. And I think, and you and I have talked about this too, that there's 2 types of kind of prompts to writing a book. One is to say, there's a lot of stuff out there about topic X, but I don't think any of it is getting it quite right. Or there's a gap here. There's something that's missing in the literature. And I think you and I are both in that latter group. We're looking for a topic that may have been covered, but that there's something missing in the way that scholars have dealt with it before. Is that something that you're consciously looking for? Like you said, there's a lot of books on Canada and World War II, but they tend to be thinking transatlantic, and you wanted to look across the U.S.-Canadian border. Is that your methodology when you're looking around at topics?
Yeah, it is. And I guess there's a couple of maybe added elements too, is that as you were generous to say at the top, I'm a public historian. I'm very lucky to be the chief historian at the Canadian War Museum. I've done that. I've worked there for over 20 years. And I often, that shapes how I approach history. I'm an academic too. I have a PhD. I've written probably 100 academic articles and chapters, peer-reviewed. I have university books, but I look for stories too. And I think that's an important way to engage, in my case, largely with Canadians, because Canadians, they want their history, but academic scholarship is written in a particular way, and it can be difficult to connect with readers. And so, I learned this years ago. I used to play hockey. Of course, every Canadian probably plays hockey, Mike. And, I don't know, maybe 30, sitting in the dressing room. I was a goalie. It was all that kind of bad chat back and forth. And someone looked over and said, "I saw you on TV last night. You looked great." And I said, "Oh, thank you. I wasn't on." I said, "That was a show from about 7 years ago." And I remember thinking the value of documentaries, of TV history, of podcasts like this, and of trying to find a way to take uh, historical topics, deep dive academic works, and finding a way to convey that to my readers. And so I've had some success there. Sometimes I do big books, works of synthesis, pulling together that literature, hundreds of books and articles with my own explorations into the archives. Sometimes it's a more narrow study. Um, and I guess to keep guys like us going, Mike, each book's got to feel different. It's got to be
Yeah.
its own
Yeah.
project, and that's an
Yeah.
important thing.
I think you and I both share that in common too. We're not the people that can sort of follow the same thing. Our brains keep going in different directions. So your comment really raised a couple of questions. I really want to ask about you as a goalie, but we'll leave that to another podcast. Do you think if you had gone a standard academic route and taken a professorship at a university that your books would have been different? How do you understand that connection between your museum experience and your profile as a writer?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think I would have been different, because my first two books are academic books with the UBC, one of our publishers.
University of British
Um,
Columbia Press for those Americans
that's
out there.
right, yeah, and good books. I think they still stand up. But at the same time as I was working on, well, my dissertation called Cleo's Warriors on the writing of Canadian military history, supervised by Jeff Gray in Australia, the Australian Defence Force Academy, and Steve Harris in Canada, I was I was working on the Canadian War Museum. We built a new museum. It opened in 2005. I was the curator for the First World War. And so I was almost transitioning my intellectual development from the deep dive, archives driven work of my first two books into this public history and thinking about your visitor, thinking about the tools we have to tell stories in a museum. It's not just words. Of course, if you rely on words, you've failed. You've got artifacts and film and works of art and reconstructed spaces and so much more. And I think that really has shaped my approach to writing military history. It's driven by those eyewitnesses to history. My work is largely on 20th century, the two world wars and the Korean War. There's such a wealth of evidence there in the official archives, but in the letters and diaries and memoirs, and in so much that I have access to in the museum world. And all of this, I think it's a great question. And yes, if I had stayed in the academy, uh, I would have been a different scholar. What? I'm not entirely sure. Maybe I would have had an epiphany at some point. Maybe I would have come to the same conclusion that we need to find ways to tell our stories and to connect with visitors. But I don't think the impetus would have been there in the same way.
Yeah, it's definitely different. You're writing for a different audience, especially as a younger, untenured professor when you're really trying to show what you can do as a scholar. So let's just take this book. Let's transition over to this particular book. So you have the idea that you want to write a book about Canada and the US during the Second World War. What's your process from there? How do you begin? That's obviously an enormous topic. How do you start to think about the way in which you want to go about turning that into a book?
Yeah, this is the big question, isn't it? Where do you start on this? And I have to tell you, I had some sleepless nights, Mike. I just,
Yeah, you have to, right?
thinking about the not the dozens, but the hundreds of potential books and articles. And that's before you even hit the archives. Now, good news is, as you know from your own work, I wasn't starting from zero. It's not like I didn't know how the war turned out or what Canada did in the war. I've, probably written 10 books or edited on the Second World War. But where to begin? And it really was challenging. I had two ideas, which of course changed, and no research plan survives contact with the archives or with reading. One of them was I had visited the World War II Museum in New Orleans, fabulous museum. I
Yeah.
know you've been there and
Yep.
acted as a consultant and other things, but there are very few references to Canada in that
Yeah.
museum.
Yeah.
And I left there thinking, oh my gosh, wow, like somebody has dropped the ball here. And I didn't blame the curators there. I thought it's up to Canadians to tell this story. I don't expect the Americans or the British or the French or the Germans to tell the Canadian story. So I left there thinking that. And I also thought this was a time in North American history that is pivotal to the development of the two countries. It's, of course, the United States rising, the key player in the Second World War, becoming the global superpower. But for Canada, it's a pivotal moment. 1.1 million Canadians serve in uniform. That's from a country of 11.5 million. Another 3 million are working in wartime industry. That's almost every adult male and woman in Canada involved in the war effort. And when I had talked to other scholars, learned people, most people didn't have a sense of Canada's contribution in the war. So there's always a little bit of an underdog thing there, or chippiness perhaps. And so I thought I would write this and call it The Good Ally, to maybe tell Americans and Canadians that this was a time when Canada played a significant role, was a consequential nation because of its wartime industry, because of its agriculture, its natural minerals, and its fighting forces, all of that together. But as I realized, as I was researching the book, and this is where the idea of no plan survives contact with research, is that the United States were good allies to Canada. And one of the central arguments I make in the book is that Canada's primary wartime aim is to keep Britain in the war. We're still a British dominion within the British Commonwealth, although everyone still refers to it as the British Empire. Britain is so deeply threatened after the fall of France, and Canada leans in. We send all of our best fighting forces to Britain, a second division, our modern destroyers, our best RCAF squadrons. And yet, to effectively send these expeditionary forces abroad, to use that term, we had to secure North America. And that involves working with the United States, which of course is neutral. And how that happened is a really complicated story that we often just skate over. And we just assume North America is secure, we can fight in multiple theaters of war. But that's not the case. And it's questions of politics and diplomacy and trade and hemispheric defense. All of that has to happen before the fighting forces go abroad. And that was part of the story that unfolded for me.
And you tell this story in a way that I really admired the way you put the chapters together. It is chronological but thematic at the same time. You have a theme or an idea that unites each chapter, and they don't go in lockstep chronological order, but they do follow a narrative that a reader can follow. That's a tricky tightrope to walk, because it's clear you don't want to go, this happened, then that happened, then that happened. You want to be touching on the themes that you just articulated, including a couple that I definitely do want to dive into a little bit further. Do you, when you're putting a book like that together, do you outline the chapters and then tend to write them in order, or do you jump around where you think you have a clear sense, or how do you think about the chapters in relation to one another, and what's your process for working on those chapters?
Yeah. I guess that's almost one of the first questions, isn't it? Chronological or thematic? And I like to read history in a chronological unfolding. I like to see how things connect. But a straight Martin Gilbert kind of day by day unfolding of the Second World War has its great appeal, but you lose the common themes often of what is unfolding there.
It doesn't let you make the argument that you want to make and the kinds of things you were talking about.
And this is where, of course, we've talked about me being a public historian, but I'm also an academic too. And I know books I like, and I'm sure you do too. And you often say, oh boy, that's a great book. I love it. You recommend it to people. You model a book that's sort of similar on that. There wasn't a lot to model on here, but there was a chronological unfolding that moves almost from the start, the 1930s, where Canada and the United States have almost no relationship. Canada's military is deeply tied to Britain. All of our service personnel have served mostly in the First World War or with British units. There's almost no connection there to hemispheric or the Northern defense. And so we have to build those structures. And then there is the declaration of war, where one country's at war, Canada, one is neutral. And if we just pause there, how strange that must have been for the Roosevelt administration to realize this country along this 9,000 kilometer border is at war. And the doomsday scenario there is something like Britain collapses and is invaded, and Canada eventually surrenders or is invaded too.
Or some part of Canada goes in the peace conference, right? Halifax or Esquimalt or something like
exactly.
that. So,
yeah.
So you need to sort of take almost a pause in the chronology to make sure that people understand just how weird this was, right? Because the way we typically teach the Second World War to people is a fairly straightforward bad to good, kind of evil to triumph kind of narrative. But there are, as you noted, there are these moments along the way that are just weird. Canada is at war. The United States is not. The U.S. is deeply concerned about what happens to Canada. Canada is equally jealous to guard its sovereignty and not let American soldiers cross over to help in its defense. So maybe that's a way to think about it. Each one of those chapters, did you think about it as a way to kind of almost stop the narrative and say, look, here's the problem. Here's another weird problem that we're dealing with?
Yeah, and some of the more peripheral elements of, say, Iceland and Greenland and the two French islands off Newfoundland's coast, which I've never, Mike, ever thought much about in talking about military history.
I didn't until I wrote the Vichy book either. And then all of a sudden, St. Pierre and Miquelon become these two incredibly important little pieces of rock in the middle of nowhere.
That's right. And what do you do there? And so there are great questions, as you've nicely summarized there, of both the White House and in Ottawa, talking, negotiating, jousting, occasionally threatening over these issues. What will we do with Newfoundland? Of course, the huge island, now a part of Canada, joining Canada in 1949, largely because of the Second World War. But both Americans and Canadians flood to Newfoundland, a separate British dominion, because it's critical for that frontier of defense. It's critical in the Battle of the Atlantic. It's critical when Germany declares war on the United States after Pearl Harbor, and the U-boats are savaging American merchant vessels along the eastern seaboard. All of these things, that's one area where I talk about some of those issues of sovereignty, where the Canadians realize we need to work with the United States here, but how we do that, I mean, they're not equal powers here, it is complicated. And it even goes back into 1940, the wartime leadership of our Prime Minister, William Lyon Mackenzie King, and President Roosevelt. That's a fascinating story. Mackenzie King, some of your listeners may not know him. He was our longest serving prime minister, 22 years. But he's come down in history as a bit of a joke. He was not charismatic. He certainly paled in comparison to Churchill and Roosevelt. And what really damned him was his own writings, because he kept a diary his whole life. And Mike, you'll remember this in the book, 30,000 pages. I've been able to go through thousands of pages. It's a great revelation of his strengths and weaknesses, everyone he met, the power plays he was engaging in. But he was also a spiritualist, and he turned to mediums and table rapping. He took advice from dead prime ministers like Gladstone, and he listened to he thought he was hearing from his dead mom and his dead dog. So for a lot of Canadian history, when this was revealed after his death in 1950, he was a bit of a joke. And yet his relationship to Roosevelt is really important. Mackenzie King understood the United States. He had worked there as a labor negotiator in the First World War. He'd gone to Harvard, and he knew that he needed the support of the United States to fully support Britain. And there's a question of heart versus head here, right? The Canadian heart is with Britain, keeping the British in the war. But we realize with our heads that we have to become more North American. And this becomes really a pivotal point in Canadian history, because after the war, we will very much be a North American nation.
You've got that great comment from Blair Fraser, the journalist at Canada, learned to speak both English and American with equal fluency, which is fantastic. One thing that came across in the book that I guess I knew, but I didn't appreciate the intensity of, was exactly this fear that Canada would emerge from World War II triumphant, but a kind of satellite of the United States. And I know in some research that I've done, Lester Pearson is very adamant about this. He's the Canadian ambassador in the United States, and he uses one phrase at one time that we're not a banana republic that you can push around. And I guess I didn't appreciate the intensity of that. Was this something you were also surprised at as you dug into the primary sources, or was this a theme that you were thinking about from the beginning? And if it was a theme you're thinking about from the beginning, was there something else that kind of really began to surprise you as you started doing the research?
It was a theme because it's the eternal one in Canada of moving, out of being a colony from Britain, largely from the Great War or the First World War, and sort of figuring out how we're going to stand as an independent nation. And then the fear that because of the Second World War, World War II, we will become a satellite of the United States. But that literature was very much colored by almost the first generation of writing in the 60s and 70s, when there was a Canadian national movement, and the U.S. is really demonized in much of that literature. So when I returned to this, having read that and understood it, I kept seeing something different, which is really how the United States continually assisted Canada over and over again, especially wartime industry, the cross-border automobile trade and manufacture. That gears right into building trucks and tanks and other armored vehicles.
Airplanes,
and that's
right?
critical.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of this American support. And Lester B. Pearson is a fabulous character in Canadian history. He's our late war ambassador to Washington. I was lucky to be invited to speak down there about a month ago to talk about him and others. He's later Prime Minister of Canada from 63 to 68, when the Auto Pact is forged and stuff. And he's often seen as this prophet of peace because he received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1957 for the Suez Crisis. But he understood the hard realities of the Cold War, and he understood the hard realities of the Canadian-American relationship during the Second World War. And he's just one of those fascinating characters to explore. Got into his archives, his letters, his diaries, and you begin to see the nuances. And I suppose, Mike, those are often the things we're looking for, aren't they?
Right.
It's not just the anecdote. It's how does it really work?
And I think you covered that beautifully in the Lend-Lease crisis. And we don't have time to get into it now because we're running short on time already. But this discussion of how the Lend-Lease is done in a way that Canada is sort of not part of the thought process, but it deeply impacts Canada, and the U.S. finds a way to make sure that it's not going to harm Canada. Before we start to run out of too much time, there is a big elephant in the room that we have not talked about, and that is, of course, the very touchy issue for Canada for both world wars, which is that the French-Canadian population inside Canada does not see either world war in the way that Anglophone Canada sees it. So what I want to ask you, and it's going to have to be, we're not going to be able to get into the whole complicated discussion, but as a writer, how do you begin to step into an issue that is that emotional, that complex in Canada, and an issue where you can anger people simply by a perfectly innocent choice of words? It's one of those hot button political issues. How did you want to handle that? And how did you think about telling the story, knowing you were going to have to talk about it, but figuring out how exactly you were going to do it without making it a kind of center point of the book?
Yeah, and French Canada during the Second World War is far more supportive and included in the war effort than the First World War, where there is a great rift and divide that really leaves a deep chasm of hurt and anger between English and French Canada. During the Second World War, French Canada is much more involved. There are independent French RCAF units and warships and infantry units and others. And the home front is harnessed more effectively. So, as part of the larger argument, Prime Minister Mackenzie King and his cabinet, they're much more effective in dealing with French Canada. And we don't have conscription until very late in the war, and then it's really limited. One of the interesting elements, you may remember, Mike, is when the U-boats come down the St. Lawrence in May of 1942, and that really brings the war home to Canadians. A bit like, I suppose, Pearl Harbor or some of the phantom threats largely along the West Coast. And that too helps to galvanize the war effort. Having said that, it is a challenging topic, and but not the one that I thought would rear up and potentially bite me. You're the first person to ask that question. I've talked
Is that
quite a
right?
bit about the book. Now, I
Is that
know
right?
you lived in Montreal for a while, didn't you?
Well,
Uh,
I've been there a lot. I've never lived
yeah,
there,
yeah.
but why do you think that is? I mean, an issue that could so easily become, is it because the Quebecois are in the kind of liberal coalition that King had built, or is this an issue people don't want to talk about now quite so much, or what do you attribute that?
No, we were lucky. King was lucky to have some very good Quebec ministers who understood Quebec and were always advising him not to push on conscription or some of the more aggressive extremist calls from English Canada. So that's an important element. The second element, too, Mike, I think, is that those English French debates really came to a head in Canada in 1995, where we had a political referendum where Quebec almost separated.
Right.
And
Right.
after that, we really began to focus more on, I suppose, easing some of those grievances. And Canada's in a different place now. In the United States, well, before the election, I would have said Black Lives Matters is such a key event. In Canada, it's reconciling sort of in treatment of Indigenous peoples in our history, which
Which has
was
been in the news a
as
lot for you,
horrific,
I know. Yeah.
yeah, as the United States. So
Yeah.
interesting, I guess. History books, even of the Second World War, are situated in a time period 39 to 45, but they always reflect the period in which we are writing. And so I don't know, 20 years from now, a different historian coming to this will probably write something different.
Right.
And I suppose that's part of it. Doesn't mean that the history has changed, but the things you emphasize, perhaps the ways you structure the book, the emphasis you put in there, even though it's a big book, I don't know, 150,000 words, great images, I think. The story we've been touching about political, diplomatic, trade, economy, defense of the East Coast, the West Coast, the North, and then fighting abroad, Canadians and Americans fighting together, often, about 30,000 Americans served in the Canadian Armed Forces, all of this unfolding. But there would have been another way to tell the story, and maybe
Absolutely.
someone will try it.
Yeah, that's the difficult challenge, right? There's always multiple ways to tell the same story. We can't get into it here, but of course, some of the first historical debates that I got into in Canada with Canadian colleagues was about the French-Canadian experience in World War I, which is an incredibly hot topic, I think, even still, with some of the controversies that went on. We are running rapidly out of time. I can't believe it already. So I'd like to end by asking two questions that I always like to ask my friends and always like to ask smart people. Tim, what are you reading right now?
What am I reading? Oh, great question. Well, Mike, probably like you, I have like 6 books beside my reading chair, and I sort of work my way through them. I'm on a bit of an RCAF kick. This is the 100th anniversary of the Royal Canadian Air Force this year, 2024. There's a great new history by David Berkison at the University of Calgary that
Great
that
guy. Dave is a lovely guy.
ambitiously tries
Yeah.
to tell that full story. And we have a pretty robust scholarship on the First World War and the Second World War, but the RCAF, the Air Force, has been terrible in writing its own history. So David's book really sheds light on the early Cold War, the late Cold War, the RCAF and the Kosovo 1999 bombing campaign, and other, Gulf War 1990-91. So this is really interesting history for me, and it does what I like history to do: is it connects the past to the present, and it does it in a readable way and in an authoritative manner.
And David's the perfect guy to do that, and also a kind of English Canadian who grew up in Montreal, so someone that has that bridge as well. Both of you are Montreal Canadiens fans, I believe.
That's right. Yeah.
Last question for you: do you have another book project in mind, or have you started it? Where are you? I'm guessing you do.
I do. I have 2 edited collections going. One is a project from the Canadian War Museum where we've been interviewing veterans from the Second World War through Korea, early Cold War, late, and Afghanistan, to try to understand what happens after military service. So, oral histories to examine the veteran's experience, as we've called it. And that's drawn together all kinds of scholars and veterans. It's going to be a great book. It should be out in a year or two at UBC. It's an academic book. And a second edited one on Canadian foreign fighters. So those Canadians fighting in other people's wars. About 40,000 Canadians served in the American Civil War. About 1,600 Canadians served in the Spanish Civil War. About 300 Canadians in the war in Israel in 1948. About 20,000 Canadians served with the U.S. in the Vietnam War. And then, Canadians are in Ukraine now fighting. So it's an underexplored aspect of Canadian military history. And, it's one of those things I'm learning a lot as I'm editing and writing a key chapter. And it's part of that joy of both delving deep into new topics, but then I hope sharing them with a wider audience.
Well, Tim, I can't believe we're out of time already. As you know, I've always loved having these discussions about Canadian history with you and my Canadian friends north of the border, and I'm grateful to you for all you do to bring Canada's history to a wide audience, not just in your country, but in mine as well. So it's been great talking to you, and hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you so much.
You can subscribe to A Better Piece on your podcatcher of choice. Please rate and review this podcast because that's how more people can hear about us so that we can continue to grow this community for conversations like this one. This conversation is over, but we look forward to welcoming you again. Until next time, from the War Room, I'm Michael Neiberg.
And that concludes our program. Thank you for listening. The views expressed in this podcast reflect those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or positions of the U.S. Army or the Department of Defense. Let us know what you think. Provide us your feedback, comments, or suggestions through our webpage at warroom.armywarcollege.edu. And have a great day.